and we're ready to get started. And I'm kind of excited because Laurel is actually in class today in actually bodily present, and so it's kind of fun to have her here. And I'm glad you girls are here, and I hope that we will shortly have some more class show up. As you look at your screen, what you see is a picture by C.C.A. Christensen, which he painted of this Hiram, Ohio mob scene that we're finally going to get to talk about today, and I hope we finish this all today, but I don't know that we will. Nevertheless, when I look at this, I see how very careful he's been in researching out the message that he's painting here, because you see mobbers over by Sidney Rigdon's house. You see Sidney Rigdon's body on the ground. You see the 12 mobbers who took Joseph, and we see Silas Raymond carrying his lantern in the foreground, and another mobber carrying a rail that they are ostensibly going to try to put Joseph on when they tar and feather him, and the 12 mobbers that are surrounded him. So he's tried to be very accurate, including the fact that Joseph said he looked up and saw the moon shining, and that's what enabled him to see Sidney's body lying over there beyond him, and the moon came up very early that morning. So this mobbing, which we usually date as March 24th, the night of March 24th, happened in the morning of the 25th. So we're going to go forward, and what we have here is our governing scripture again, that the Lord is going to give these scriptures as they are in His bosom, and they will be preserved in safety, but as we mentioned before, it's not going to be easy. Our lesson considerations are: what led to the tar and feathering episode in March of 1832? What did the receipt of Section 76 have to do with this assault? And how do we last find the apostates who attacked the church in Hiram, Ohio? So those are the things that we're going to be talking about. And when we were last talking, we discussed how we had two very ostentatious gentlemen who came into the church, Simon's Ryder and Ezra Booth, who gave the church a boost in the Hiram, Ohio area, but who both left the church shortly. Booth had come into the church as a response to the miracle of the healing of Elsa Johnson's arm, and he had an influence on Simon's Ryder, who believed his testimony more or less and came into the church at his urging and was baptized by Ezra Booth. And then both of them left the church. Simon's Ryder probably because he didn't like the idea of the law of consecration, and Ezra Booth because he was a very fine man and didn't think the church appreciated it. So that's where we were. And Ezra Booth wrote a series of 9 letters to the Ohio Star that were very damaging to the church and did a great deal of harm, and were later reprinted in an anti-Mormon book, first anti-Mormon book by E.D. Howe, Mormonism Unveiled. So when we left, the last comment that was posed in class came from Laurel, and she mentioned the idea that the effect of these things could have been double-edged. While they did damage on the one hand, they might have done some good on the other. So I think where we left was on this slide of Father Ira Ames, who told us that he was living in New York, that when he read Booth's letters in the Ohio Star, he felt there was something to Mormonism. So instead of being impressed negatively, he responded positively. And he says there was considerable talk about it in the neighborhood, and he joined the church when the missionaries came to his village in 1832. And this is the only photograph that I could find of him, and it's not particularly good, but it's the best we can do. Another individual who listened to Booth promote the Book of Mormon and then turn against the church recalled that Booth had preached at Bates Corner in Norton to a numerous assembly, where for the first time I saw the Book of Mormon and was taught from it. Not long after, we read Booth's letters as published in the Ohio Star, and although he didn't prove that the Book of Mormon wasn't true, he gave the whole work such a coloring or appearance of falsehood that the public feeling was that Mormonism was overthrown. Now, if you can remember, we mentioned section 71 where the Lord told Joseph and Sidney to stop translating for a while, to go out and start preaching the gospel, to overcome the influence that Ezra Booth was having. Not only were they to go out and preach, but they were to call missionaries to go out and preach. And in essence, this was a PR campaign for the church, and so they did. And this Brother Ambrose Palmer says to us afterwards, we received preaching from Brother Reynolds Cahoon, David Whitmer, and Lyman E. Johnson, and later also listened to Brother Thomas B. Marsh and others, which left an impression on the minds of many that was not easily eradicated, and the way being thus prepared, the Lord in His providence sent Brother Milton Stowe among us, who baptized a number of persons. So what we see here is some good coming out of the evil, and interestingly, the Lord, knowing the hearts of those people, knew who was going to respond positively and who was not, and those who listened to evil tales and had the Spirit of the Lord were able to discern where they were coming from. So we had Joseph Smith going through all of these troubles while he was living in Kirtland in a little house that the church built for him on the property of the Morley farm. And he continued to work with Sidney on the new translation while he was there. And while they were there, still in Kirtland, Emma had her twins. Now, Emma lost her first child prior to coming into Ohio, which was a little baby that they named Alvin, and this child was buried in Harmony, Pennsylvania, where he was born. And Emma here has twins. So by now she's had 3 children. And these twins were born on April 30th, 1831. And Samuel Whitney, who is apparently a relative of Newell K. Whitney, described this delivery, or a delivery on the Isaac Morley farm, which actually pertained to Emma. She had hard labor, and the blood went to her head. Now, what that meant, I'm sure we wouldn't, it doesn't actually compute to me everything that was going on there. He further describes it and says that Emma was turning black, and that the prophet was extremely frightened, and he sent to a neighboring town for Dr. Card, and the non-members ridiculed him for doing that, saying that the Mormons didn't believe in calling on doctors, which was a misunderstanding of how the gospel works. The doctor came, and whether he helped her or not, I wonder, because what he did to save her was to bleed her. And these 2 little babies died in a few hours. And what you can see here is a little section of Emma's Bible. And she has recorded in here the birth of her, you can see her name, Joseph's name, her name, the birth of her first child that died in 1828, and then these 2 little twins, Thaddeus and Louisa, who died on April 30th, 1831, and then the names of the 2 little twins, Joseph Murdoch Smith and Julia Murdoch Smith, that they adopted later, or actually 9 days later. And this is the story of that. While they were in Kirtland, Emma became acquainted with John Murdoch's wife, Julia Clapp Murdoch. Julia Clapp Murdoch is the sister-in-law of Alexander Campbell, this great Campbellite preacher, and she had twins on the same day that Emma did, or possibly the next day. And, well, here it is, April 30th. It's the same day. And John Murdoch wrote in his journal, on April 30th, my wife died, leaving me with 5 small children, but two but 6 hours old. So these little twins, Joseph and Julia, needed a wet nurse immediately, and they were put into Emma's care, and Joseph and Emma adopted those 2 little children. Bereaved of her own children, she could have given little Joseph and Julia Murdoch her full attention. And Emma wanted, in the worst way, to be a mother. And if we were looking at this a few years later, when she receives her patriarchal blessing from Father Smith, he tells her that the Lord knows how her heart is longed for children, and that she would have children, and that he was mindful of what she had been through. Well, here she has these 2 little children, and that's the beginning of a little family for Joseph and Emma. Now, when Isaac Morley, who owned the farm where all the saints had been converted, who had gathered together, who were trying to live a quote-unquote type of law of consecration, joined the church. He was sent with Ezra Booth to the mission in Missouri. And this is the mission in which Ezra Booth became so discouraged because he didn't go in a carriage, and he was told by the Lord to walk by the way, and he lost his testimony over it because he was too fine a man to do that. Isaac Morley got a little discouraged also, but he humbled himself, and when he came back, instead of leaving the church, he determined that he would sell his farm and move his family to Missouri, and this was his intention. So when he sold this farm, Joseph and Emma didn't have a place anymore to stay in Kirtland, and this is how they got into Hiram, Ohio. So according to Philo Dibble, on the invitation of Father Johnson, Joseph agreed to move Emma and the twins to Hiram, and they set up housekeeping on the main floor of this beautiful home that we're looking at here. Okay, now, hi Spencer, I'm glad to see you in class this morning. So this is kind of a little bit of a catch-up or an effort for us to begin to see how it is that they got there. Now, when Joseph got into Hiram, Ohio, he still had this same trouble of trying to finance his work with the translation. And while they were at the Johnson home, Brother and Sister Johnson were actually providing for Joseph and Emma in a large sense, and for many other saints who were beginning to come in there into Hiram. And Joseph asked missionaries to supplement their charity by asking help from local members. So David Whitmer and Reynolds Cahoon took the primary responsibility with assistance from Simeon Carter, Orson Hyde, Hiram Smith, and Emer Harris. So what we know is that all of these people are now gathered around and living in Hiram, Ohio, and that they have followed the prophet and come into this township and are living there. Now, across the street from the Johnson farm, there is a little series of cabins built where a lot of these people moved, and Sidney Rigdon was one of them, and we'll see here in just a little bit how a home was provided for him. So the Johnsons were making these things available to a lot of people, and obviously help was needed, and so these missionaries were sent out to raise funds, and they were successful. And so as they went about their work, Sidney recalled their translation here in Hiram was the beginning of good days. But he also remembered that they were shut up in a little room eating nothing but dry Johnny cake and buttermilk, and every man who had a little farm or clothes sold and distributed it. Or in other words, they were sort of living a law of consecration and tried to help each other out and sold what they had and shared and blessed each other along the way. So those are kind of interesting beginnings in Hiram, Ohio. Now this is what Father John Johnson did for Sidney. Just across the street from that great big beautiful house, he had a home built for Sidney and Phoebe Rigdon and their 6 children. It just amazes me, the small spaces that these people live in. This was a remodeled cabin, and he had Gersom Judson, who was a handyman in neighboring Mantua, come and build a second story on the top of this log main level, and it created an odd piece of frontier architecture. This Gersom Judson was probably a member of the church at the time. At least he joined the church and then later turned against the church. So here's an interesting interaction between early members of the church. And now Sidney had a place to live, and they had a number of neighbors, including David Whitmer, who just married Julia Jolly. So David Whitmer at the time was a young, handsome man, and not this elderly gentleman that we always get to look at because we don't have a system to revise those pictures so that we can see these people as they looked in their younger years. That's what we need. So now, what have we got? We've got Sydney and Joseph in Hiram, Ohio. They've been working on the new translation since December in 1830 up in New York. And everywhere they go, the Lord just keeps telling them, go back to that, go back to that, go back to that, and that's what they're doing. And in the process, they are counseled to study. So they have studied very diligently, and what we find here is that Sidney comes into the church after a long period of preaching for the Campbellites in his own Reformed Baptist church, and assuming the things that he has been teaching are the gospel. And so wherever there is a gap in his learning, it's filled up by things that he already knows or that he thinks that he knows. So one non-Mormon observer captured the state of the church up to then by saying, even after Rigdon became known as a Mormon, his sermons were filled with as sound disciple, meaning disciples of Christ, Campbellite doctrines as they had before he joined up with Joseph Smith. Now, this is actually a normal thing that we probably would have to expect would happen. It isn't possible that all of a sudden, overnight, he comes into the church, reads the Book of Mormon, and knows everything. So he wasn't the only one that brought these beliefs along with him. Other people did. Other preachers among the disciples of Christ who were Campbellites were Parley Pratt, Orson Hyde, John Murdoch, Isaac Morley, and Lyman White. So these people came in bringing a lot of their old beliefs with them. So many of the ideas they continued teaching came out of the theology of Walter Scott and Alexander Campbell. And we kind of have to bear this in mind. One of the problems that comes with this is when members of the church or students of the gospel go back and study this period, they will make a commentary such as, these brethren and Joseph were building on the doctrines of Scott and Campbell. This is not true. Joseph never built on any other man's doctrines, and it doesn't matter how close Alexander Campbell and Walter Scott may have got to the truth. This is not Joseph's originating place. Nevertheless, the Campbellites sometimes felt, as Walter Scott said, that the Mormons, and particularly Sidney, he was aiming his barbs at, filched their doctrine from the Campbellites. But when people come into the church, very often they bring some of their other beliefs with them, and that's a normal thing that has to be overcome. So this is part of the reason that the Lord is taking Sidney through this experience of translation. So why don't we just ask any of you who want to comment on that, what you have observed in your own experience with this sort of thing, either in your own life or people that you've seen come into the church. Do you have a thought? Either yes. No thought. No thoughts. Okay, cool. We'll just get on with things.
My husband's in Texas from a small branch, and you go there, and there's a lot of, during testimony meeting, they'll hallelujah, they'll praise the Lord.
Oh, this is cool. Now, Laurel is sitting here, and I wish she had a microphone. But what she's saying is her husband's from Texas, and sometimes they're in the branch. People who come into the church will respond what I would assume is in the Baptist way of hallelujah, praise the Lord, because they're accustomed to that as a way of worshiping. So when you come into the church, you've got to learn a whole new system, and this is not really easy. So the Lord is giving them an opportunity to not only learn a great deal more, but to replace the system that they already have in their hearts and minds with something that is better. So we'll go a little bit further here. So the disciples, meaning of Christ, the disciples of Christ who came from the Campbellite movement, who accepted the Book of Mormon and joined the Mormonite congregations, had these teachings fresh on their minds, and the correct interpretation of Scripture was waiting for revelation to come to the prophet Joseph Smith. And here we see Sydney's church. This is a respectable congregation that he had in Mentor, and these people thought they were sophisticated religiously. Okay, so Sydney had the same difficulty, and so he comments that he and Joseph Smith spent weeks seeking God with prayer and fasting. Now they had to do that, and we have to anticipate that some of the questions that came up while they were translating the Bible and they were studying it came from Sydney's background and what he already supposed the Scriptures meant. So in a way, he was contributing to that revelatory process. Now they kept working on this, and this is important because this is where we have to get. We're going to the great vision that is called in the church the vision, or which these people began to call the vision, which is section 76. And so they tell us that on February 16th, which was a cold Thursday morning, they came to John chapter 5, verse 29, and Joseph wrote about this, and he said, and you can see this reasoning comes out of discussions that they have had, from sundry revelations which had been received, it was apparent that many important points touching the salvation of man had been taken from the Bible or lost before it was completed. Now, obviously, they have come to this point. This is why they got the whole book of Moses. And in Moses chapter 1, verses 41 and 42, Joseph told you're going to get a whole lot more stuff. So be ready for it. And Joseph says it appeared self-evident from what truths were left that if God rewarded everyone according to the deeds done in the body, the term heaven, as intended for the saints' eternal home, must include more kingdoms than one. So he says we're translating this, and we are asking this question, and we're thinking about it, and we receive a vision which is now recorded as section 76. Our purpose today is not to study that section, but to recognize that they received it, and that this was probably, or it has been labeled, the greatest of all the visions that Joseph received, doctrinally speaking. Now here's an interesting thing about this before we go too far. Alexander Campbell had his own little vision of 3 kingdoms. He called them the kingdoms of the flesh, the kingdom of the law, the kingdom of glory. And he didn't really have a good explanation as to what any of these things were, but according to your various the various levels of faith in the Campbellite system, you were going to earn something lesser or greater according to those 3 kingdoms that he devised up in his revelation, in which he says a man named Simeon, who was a Jew, came and explained this interesting doctrine to him. These Campbellites who came into the church have heard of those 3 kingdoms, and now we have Joseph talking to us about what he saw in the vision. And he tells us in the vision that the mysteries of the kingdom will be revealed to all the faithful. He tells us that in the first 10 verses. He then goes on to tell us that an angel of God fell and became the devil. He gives a history there of how Lucifer became the adversary. He tells us in this revelation that the Lord will save all the works of his hands except the sons of perdition, and that those who shall inherit the celestial, terrestrial, and telestial kingdoms are thus and so people. I should have clarified that and made that more understandable. But here we have some interesting doctrinal things revealed to Joseph that are annoying to the Campbellites. First of all, they don't think that the mysteries of the kingdom ought to be revealed because these things are what they call illicit information. The most illicit information of all appears to be the description that Joseph Smith gives of how Satan became the devil. They prefer not to know that and don't think he has a right to expose this idea. As we'll see in a later slide, they call it these ideas doctrinal crimes. And another thing that annoys them terribly is that the Lord would save all the works of his hands with some degree of salvation or another. They didn't care about the sons of perdition, but they didn't want little babies being saved because it was contrary to their system. And here we have a discussion of 3 degrees of glory that men will inherit according to their works and faith. Now, when Joseph received this revelation, it obviously was extremely uplifting to him, and he felt a sense of exaltation, and he wrote about it. And he said everything that's in here touching the destiny of man, every promise, every truth, every point touching the destiny of man from Genesis to Revelation, where the purity of the Scriptures remains unsullied by the folly of men, goes to show the perfection of the theory of the different degrees of glory, and witnesses the fact that the document is a transcript from the world's records of the eternal world. So he's bearing testimony of this, and his testimony is very beautiful, I think. He says here, the sublimity of the ideas, the purity of the language, the scope for action, the continued duration for completion, in order that the heirs of salvation may confess the Lord and bow the knee, the rewards for faithfulness and punishments for sins, are so much beyond the narrow-mindedness of men that every honest man is constrained to exclaim, it came from God. Well, a lot of people didn't exclaim that. But as Joseph saw it, and as Joseph felt the truth of and the reason of what was revealed to him, he felt the majesty of the things that had been given. So he understands this remarkable vision. In fact, he says, if people had been a little more faithful, I could have explained 100-fold more than I ever have of the glories of the kingdoms manifest to me in the vision where I permitted, and were the people prepared to receive them. Interestingly, I think we're in the same condition today because we have a larger church with people coming in rapidly, bringing with them their own traditions, and coming into a situation where we have all kinds of degrees of understanding in the church, so we still don't get to hear the rest of what Joseph saw quite yet. Now Brigham comes along and he says, lo and behold, here comes this vision. And it was so directly contrary to my former education, I said, okay, hold on, I have to wait a little while. At least he did that. But I didn't reject it, he says. I couldn't understand it. I could feel, and I think this is very interesting, I could then feel what incorrect traditions had done for me. He could see the truth of this revelation, but it was probably what we might say is mind-boggling, or was mind-boggling to him. Suppose all that I have heard from my priest and parents, the way they taught me to read in the Bible, had been true, my understanding would be diametrically opposed to the doctrine revealed in the vision. I never could believe like the mass of the Christian world around me, but I didn't know how nigh I believed as they did. So when he got a copy of that vision in his hands, he discovered that he was a little more Gentile than he thought he was. I found, however, that I was so nigh I could shake hands with it any time I wished. So that's how close he was to the sectarian world. And we are all more or less like that when we come into the gospel. We have something to learn. So in the beginning, initial phases, people didn't necessarily receive this vision well. So Brigham said, when God revealed to Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon that there was a place prepared for all according to the light they'd received and their rejection of evil and practice of good, it was a great trial to many. And some apostatized because God wasn't going to send to everlasting punishment heathens and infants, but had a place of salvation in due time for all, and would bless the honest and virtuous and truthful, whether they ever belonged to any church or not. So the Lord has a system for all of his children. Well, this thinking is what Walter Scott of the Campbellite movement condemned the Mormonites for and called their doctrinal crimes. And he didn't like preaching general atonement, that everybody was going to be saved with some degree of salvation after they had come to an acknowledgement of their circumstances. And universal salvation was another doctrine he didn't like. The promised redemption of liars, adulterers, and murderers bothered him the most. Now you can see that, but what Joseph Smith does is explain that God has a program for those people and that eventually every knee will bow and every tongue confess. And so there's a process here, and God isn't going to throw off any of his children, but he will bless them in the degree that it is possible for him to do. So we have levels. Reverend Campbell criticized the vision, and he says, it seems Smith and Rigdon have become wiser than the apostles of God. So he also viewed this vision as illicit understanding, and he had already announced that it was heresy to say that infants, idiots, and pagans could be redeemed from the fall. So when we look at that and you think about that kind of doctrine, what does that bring to mind? What's going to happen to infants and quote-unquote idiots and pagans in his view? Any thoughts here?
Well, we'll see. I find it. Go
Okay.
ahead.
No,
Kathy?
go ahead, Kathy.
Okay,
I
Kathy?
just thought it was interesting that the Mormons were criticized for believing in general atonement for everyone except for a few sons of perdition, and now we're being criticized for not believing in everyone's saved by grace. You know, all they have to do is say they believe in Christ. It's like we've come full circle.
Yeah, that's true. I'm just going to repeat for Laurel that the mantra today is that everybody is saved by grace, whatever they do. Julie, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say one of the reasons people were unhappy with Christ is he taught that, or he was going to take the gospel to pagans or to heathens, so the gospel was going to go to everybody. And I guess that kind of goes against like a chosen people concept.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Okay, Laurel, she mentions that Christ offended people when he said the gospel was going to go to the whole world because the chosen people thought they were the only ones. So that is an interesting fact, and actually that's what these people are more or less doing. One of them said, this doctrine really offends me because I don't like the such and such family, and I don't want to think that they are not going to hell. So Ezra Booth writes this is an influential thing that he did in one of his letters to the Ohio Star. He criticized the new translation of the Bible, ridiculing the saints by saying their translation of the Bible is too defective to be trusted and has to be changed, and that their revelations are negating the use of the Bible. I'm going to go on a little bit further because we have to get hopefully further today. This had an effect on a lot of members of the church who didn't have sufficient strength or testimony to follow the prophet. And as one of them announced in the Millennial Harbinger, which is a disciples' newspaper, I believe in the prophecies which have been given, and I expect no other. I renounce my belief in Mormonism. Well, a lot of the anger that was engendered in the mob that tarred and feathered Joseph Smith came at Sidney Rigdon as a former Campbellite preacher, and a lot of this anger came from new doctrine. This anger was religiously motivated. Now, I thought a lot about that because why is it that a new idea would make people so mad? All kinds of other ideas are presented that are new that don't make people mad. Nobody got so angry with Alexander Campbell for his 3 degrees of glory that they wanted to go and mob him. But what happens here? I'm just going to have to assume the thing that happens here is that people feel they're losing their power or they are being displaced. and I would like to hear from you as to what you think makes them so mad at a doctrine that they want to come and kill somebody or nigh unto it. Any thoughts?
Well, usually people get mad at something that condemns them, but I'm not sure how this doctrine would have condemned them.
Oh, I think that's interesting. They do usually get mad at something that condemns them. And that is funny because this doctrine doesn't condemn them but gives them hope whatever their situation is. But it perhaps releases their grasp on power. And why somebody who was a member of the church would be so offended at it, I don't know that I know. But what we do learn is that the people who mobbed Joseph and Hiram over this doctrine were primarily Latter-day Saints at the time of the deed. Now, my husband read that this morning and he got upset with this slide and he said, Latter-day Saints don't do this. So I accommodated him by pointing out to you that these are the erstwhile Latter-day Saints. And we'll make a point of that in the next slide. Obviously, they don't have a testimony. So one of the people who lived in Hiram, Ohio, who was not a member of the church, recalled that the people who committed this crime of mobbing Hiram and Joseph were some who had been dupes of this deception or Mormonism, and they were determined to get rid of Joseph and Sidney. So they had decided that now they had greater light and that they had been deceived, they would take after them. So they are described as being apostates. At least some of the mob showed up the next morning after the mobbing in church. And Mr. Staker says here, this is probably to keep their deeds from their still believing families. Okay, another thing that comes along is that the Mormons are talking about going to Missouri, and this makes others of these Latter-day Saints angry, these erstwhile Latter-day Saints, because they're not going to Missouri, but they have relatives who say they are, and they are angry about it. So these are motivations, and so they get ready to tar and feather Joseph Smith. And the facts are that they need a leader, and the leader is actually going to be Simon's Rider, an apostate, or one of these prominent two men that we've talked about already for the influence they had in the church and out of the church. So a few days before the mobbing occurred, somebody bored an auger hole in the house in which Sidney Rigdon lived and filled it up with powder and tried to blow up the cabin. What happened there and how that was interrupted, I don't know, but that would have been extremely frightening to that family. And then Simon's Rider himself says that on March 24th, a Saturday, the community raised up a company to mob them, and in actuality, this community of Hiram, Ohio, didn't provide all the mobbers. They came from several communities around, and in reality, instead of it being 100 people or some great troop you might imagine, there were probably 24 people involved. Now, the militia captain in Hiram, Ohio was Simon's Rider, and he provided the leadership. So when they got ready to mob the brethren, they were thinking ahead, and they poisoned the Johnson's dog to prevent it from warning trespassers were coming in the night. And during the day, John Johnson's brother, Eli, joined with them and entered John Johnson's house and spiked the Johnson's guns by inserting some object in the pistols' barrels so they couldn't be used against them when they came to attack in the evening. And they also tampered with the door to the Smith quarters so they could get in easily. So they're preparing ahead, and they have help from within the family through the use of John Johnson's brother, who had joined the church and is now an apostate. And I have to tell you that he died later a drunk and was mourned by very few people, nevertheless. So I guess I'm saying he got his due. Now all this mob gets together at Benjamin Hinckley's brickyard. Benjamin Hinckley is one of these erstwhile members of the church. His wife is very faithful. His ardor cooled, but she remained faithful till she died. And she always maintained in her heart the hope that the Lord was coming very soon. We still are hoping that. Eli Johnson, Father John Johnson's brother, and Silas Raymond, another member of the church, provided at least 1 bucket of tar. And Pelatiah Allen, a member of the church who was a local justice of the peace, brought a barrel of whiskey to warm the gathering up. They gathered in the brick kiln of Mr. Hinckley, who was also the schoolmaster, blackened their faces, and waited till morning to begin their attack, and divided into 2 groups. This picture is Benjamin Hinckley's home, and his brick kiln would be in back of this, removed from the house a considerable distance. They prepared at the kiln, and after the mobbing they went back to the kiln and washed the blacking off their faces and took their clothing and buried it, which was rather interesting. 1 dozen of the men went to Sidney's house and burst in on his family, who were sick with the measles. And Sidney was yanked out of bed and said to them, recognizing many of them as being from his former congregation, that he presumed they were gentlemen and would behave like gentlemen, which they didn't. And Sidney tells us what happened to him. And this is interesting because we seldom see an account of what happened to Sidney. He says, I was dragged out of bed, put on a large wood pile. Some were piling wood on me. They took him by his feet. My head went thump, thump upon the frozen ground. Then they threw a quantity of pitch on me, and when they attempted to throw something else on me, I fell. And the next morning, when I went to the same place, I found it was a quantity of aquafortis, or nitric acid, they were going to throw on me. He tells later in Nauvoo, in the conference meeting of April 1844, that this mobbing occurred at the time that we sat for hours in the visions of heaven around the throne of God and gazed upon the scenes of eternity. Afterwards, the mob came in and broke the door and took me out dragged me through the streets. Now we have Joseph Smith's account. This is an account that may be familiar to some of you, but Joseph says he and Emma had been taking care of these little twins who both had the measles, and it caused their rest to be broken. And he told her to go to bed and rest with one of the children, and he'd watch with the sicker child. And in the night, she told him to lie down on the trundle bed at the side of the main bed, and he did. And he was awakened with her screaming murder, and he found himself going out the door in the hands of about 12 men, some of whose hands were in my hair, some had hold of my shirt drawers and limbs. Now Joseph Smith makes an accurate telling of whatever he tells. He says 12 men, as we saw that picture in the beginning by C.C.A. Christensen. We have the 12 men taking care of Sidney, 12 taking care of Joseph. As he was being taken out, he struggled to get free. He got one leg free and kicked one of these mobbers with it, and this gentleman fell on the doorsteps. I was immediately overpowered again, and they swore blankety blank that they would kill me if I didn't be still, and so I was quiet, he said. And this individual that he kicked was a man, former member of the church, named Warren Waste, who considered himself to be the strongest man in Portage County, and he declared that Joseph was the strongest man he ever met up with. And when they began the mobbing, Warren Waste told the rest of the gentlemen there, I'll go by myself. I can take him and manage him without any help. Joseph says they seized him by the throat and held on till he lost his breath. When he came to, he saw Elder Rigdon stretched out on the ground where they had dragged him by his heels. I supposed he was dead. They then decided that they would kill him, and they had a discussion about it, and he says decided not to kill me, but to beat and scratch me, tear off my clothes, and leave me naked. One cried, Simon, Simons, where's the tar bucket? I don't know, answered one, 'tis where Eli left it. Well, Simon's we know, and Eli is Father John Johnson's brother. They tried to twist the tar paddle into my mouth. They tried to force a vial into my mouth and broke it in my teeth. My clothes were torn off me, except my shirt collar. One fell on me and scratched my body with his nails like a mad cat, and then muttered out, "This is the way the Holy Ghost falls on you." When they left me, I attempted to rise, but fell again, and I pulled the tar away from my lips so that I could breathe more freely. And he made his way toward a light which he saw in the distance, which proved to be Father Johnson's house. And when he came to the door, he says I was naked. The tar made me look as if I were covered with blood, and when my wife saw me, she thought I was all crushed to pieces and fainted. Now the sisters of the neighborhood now had gathered into what Joseph calls their room, and he asked for a blanket. They threw him one. He wrapped it around me. He says, I wrapped it around me and went in. Now, Sister Johnson got a lot of lard out of her kitchen, and she spent the night with Emma and some of the others trying to scrape the tar off Joseph's body so that he could go in the morning to preach. In the morning, he shows up to preach, not at the John Johnson house, but at the schoolhouse where Mr. Hinckley is the schoolmaster, and Mr. Hinckley is the man who owned the kiln where they heated up the tar and got ready. And Joseph says in the congregation was Simon's writer, Mr. McClintock, who had his hands in Joseph's hair and pulled some of it out so that it left a large patch, bald spot, one Streeter, the son of a Campbellite minister, Felatiah Allen, who brought the whiskey, and many others of the mob, and I preached to the congregation in the afternoon, baptized 3. The next morning, Joseph went to see Sidney and found him crazy, he said. His head was highly inflamed, for they dragged him by his heels, and he says when he saw me, he called his wife to bring a razor. She asked him what he wanted it for. Sidney said he wanted to kill Joseph. Well, he was delirious. He didn't know what he was saying. He also told Joseph get him a razor because he wanted to kill his wife. So he just truly is out of his mind. Now, the feathers that were used were taken from Elder Rigdon's house. Not all of them, but at least some. One of the mobbers went back to her house to get some pillows, and when he came into the house to get a pillow, Sister Rigdon and a young girl who was engaged to Peter Whitmer Jr., just a slight little thing, locked him in, held him prisoner for some time, but he finally got out. Now, the victim of this mobbing, saddest little story, was that Joseph and Emma's little adopted son, Joseph Smith Murdoch, who had measles, took cold, and died Thursday following and was buried the Monday after that. When his natural father, John Murdoch, visited his brother and sister-in-law, Alexander Campbell, they were very unsympathetic, he says. Now, Heber C. Kimball says that when this mobbing occurred, Joseph's spirit left his body at a point at which they had tried to break his neck, pouring the aquafortis or nitric acid down his mouth and calling upon him to get his God to help him. Another testimony here is given by Bishop Frederick Kessler, who says Joseph told him the same thing, that his spirit left his body, hovered over in the air, and returned when it was over. Now, I want to quickly go through a few things here because we will be able to manage getting through this so we can go on to the saints going into Missouri. But Silas Raymond, who brought the tar bucket, passed it down in his family, but told them on his deathbed that he didn't care what church they joined, but he wanted to tell them that he realized that Joseph Smith was what he claimed to be, a prophet of God, and his children recorded that and kept the bucket and didn't join the church. Simon's writer claimed that his participation in the mob proves that 2 wrongs sometimes make a right. One of his wrongs was joining the church, and I don't know what his participation in the mob, I guess, is his other wrong, but that made a right. He couldn't get a congregation together as he went about preaching again for years and years. He finally did, and eventually he built himself a church, and he made it look like the Kirtland Temple, and he put a pulpit in it that looked like the three-tiered pulpit in the Kirtland Temple. And this is kind of interesting to me because his wife was faithful a long time after he left the church, and she had told him she wanted to give her property to Joseph to build a temple in Hiram, Ohio, but this is his answer to her. When he finally got a large enough congregation to have any respectability, they voted him out as the preacher. When he died, it was said at his funeral, may God grant that we do our work as well as he did, and then we can go in peace like he did. Ezra Booth settled back into his home. He'd mocked Joseph's warning that he wouldn't find any satisfaction if he left the church, and it turned out he didn't. And he went from one thing to another, ceased to pray, abandoned Christianity, and became an agnostic. So B.H. Roberts goes out and interviews the neighbors, and he interviews Simon's writer's son, and Simon's writer's son says, "Oh, Ezra Booth was never successful at anything else that he tried. He tried spiritualism, he left the Mormons, he became an infidel, and he died without any faith in God and man, and was buried next to his wife and daughter in Ohio, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio." So we see somewhat what came to these people who so assaulted the prophet Joseph Smith during the tar and feathering. Dr. Dennison, who tried to force the aquafortis down his throat, also threatened to emasculate the prophet, and some accounts say that he quavered and decided not to, which is probably a misreading of the account because his true intent was actually to kill Joseph, and this is a doctor who died in prison for numerous crimes. So we kind of come to the end of that experience of the mobbing in Hiram, Ohio. This was the first physical assault that Joseph and Sidney had experienced. One thing that happened to me as I studied this is that I couldn't help but feel love for Sidney Rigdon for what he went through along with the prophet Joseph Smith. Well, what we're going to do next time is go into a discussion of how the saints get into Missouri, and some of those things are just absolutely fascinating as we continue on the search for Zion and where the temple should be built. So I hope to see you next Monday in class. Thank you.